This week on Act Out, Hurricane Harvey continues to wreak havoc even as the storm has died. We take a look at the capitalist machine that not only worsens storms, but orchestrates the aftermath, letting history be our guide. Next, we'll shine a light on what has, is, and will continue to mitigate the worst effects of both climate change and capitalism. Hint, they're not afraid to punch a Nazi. And finally, some upcoming frontline battles that you need to know about. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A Norwich flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your very sunny tipping point. By now that you've no doubt seen countless images, videos, and posts about Hurricane Harvey, ranging from the terror porn industrial complex looking to make ratings off of the suffering of others, to arguments over funding, spending, relief, aid, insurance, and any other words that you can use to say, who's going to pay for all this? Who's gonna help? Well, to start off this week, I want to take a look at some old news that might give us some insight into answering those questions. And then on to what's going on right now in Texas and the folk devils answering those questions with action. But first, let's go back. On September 30th, 2005, Louisiana state officials ordered the charity hospital in New Orleans to be closed indefinitely. At the time, it was the second oldest and second largest free hospital in the history of the United States. It had, in fact, operated continuously for almost 300 years, opening its doors in 1736 with money donated by a dying French sailor who felt that there should be a facility in the city to care for the poor and sick. By the early 2000s, almost 75% of charity's patients were Black and 85% made less than $20,000 a year. Charity was also the primary health care provider for those without insurance. In 2003, 83% of its inpatient care and 88% of its outpatient care were uncompensated and given to the uninsured. Now, considering that 21% of Louisiana residents had no health insurance before Katrina, the third highest rate in the nation, and that about a fifth of New Orleans residents live below the poverty line, there should be a damn good reason why you'd opt to close down a public hospital. And if you're thinking, well, Eleanor, that damn good reason probably has to do with unfixable damage suffered during Hurricane Katrina. Well, you'd be wrong. During the storm, Charity Hospital only flooded in the basement. And even when electricity went out, staff used handheld breathing machines to keep patients alive while signaling for help with sheets and signs hanging from windows. After the storm, a 200-person medical and military team brought in a generator, pumped the water that was there out, and scrubbed clean 3 full floors of the hospital in preparation for immediate use. On September 21st, military had declared the hospital medical ready, and even State Treasurer John Kennedy toured the hospital, concluding that the hospital was, quote, just fine. They could have opened it back up. They just needed to turn on the electricity. So, why didn't they? Why did a fully functioning hospital turn into this? Well, University Medical Center, New Orleans, a $1.1 billion private hospital erected at a different location that's separated from the downtown core by an interstate highway. This brand spankin' new hospital seems rather absurd in a city where, as of 2015, the same year the new hospital opened, by the way, many residents were still waiting for hurricane-damaged streets to be repaired. Indeed, the millions of dollars required to open this new private facility wasn't at all in the state budget, particularly when you consider the fact that Charity Hospital was still operational. But to the powers that be, these were just minor hurdles, as was the fact that a full 83% of locals polled wanted to keep Charity Hospital open. But in a chain of classic shock doctrine shuffling that ran all the way up to Governor Blanco, a closed-door panel decided on a FEMA payment of over $470 million for damage to Charity, but that money would go towards the new medical center. And today, Charity Hospital building still stands, a tombstone in the midst of a living graveyard, where more than a decade later, the aftershocks of the natural disaster pale in comparison to the human disaster that followed, of which Charity Hospital is just one, albeit a giant, example. In truth, Charity and the public hospital model it embodied had been on the chop block for a really long time. All the powers that be needed was a good excuse. And there's never as good of an excuse as a natural disaster, particularly if you've been both passively and indeed actively avoiding proper disaster preparation for years. Indeed, if you look at the timeline of events, the incompetence and gross unpreparedness of government officials was only matched by the tragic inevitability of it all. As outlined in a September 2005 Newsweek article on the government's response to Katrina, for years, the Army Corps of Engineers has asked for more money for New Orleans and not received it. The Bush administration, strapped by the war in Iraq and eager to hold down spending and cut taxes, actually reduced funding for bolstering the city's levees. Patchworked and aging, the levee system was originally built to withstand a Category 3 hurricane. With winds reaching 140 miles an hour, Katrina was a Category 4 storm when it hit New Orleans at dawn on Monday. And there is the nutshell explanation of the infrastructure pitfalls of this country in one paragraph. Money for war, money for the rich, fuck the poor. And then when you add to this clusterfuck situations like telling tens of thousands of people to crowd into a Superdome where you have no food, no water, no electricity or facilities, when you try to scramble 1,000+ buses last minute because you didn't think of it earlier, when you tiptoe around sending an aid because you kind of don't want to step on anyone's toes or appear weak, or when you set up a fucking medical clinic and triage on an interstate because that's the only place to get people to, when you tell cops to stop rescuing people and instead go arrest people who are taking food from stores to survive, when you rip families apart because, you know what, I'm not really sure whose kid that is, oh, just throw them on a bus. When you take the absolute disdain that this country has for poor and black people, it was absolutely inevitable the human disaster of Katrina far overshadowed the natural disaster. And now, 12 years later, we see the same catastrophe inevitably unfolding in Houston. Houston has been a flooding calamity waiting to happen for decades. The local and state governments stubbornly have refused to prepare it for a perfectly predictable meteorological catastrophe. Between its Wild West zoning practices, its lascivious and unregulated romance with the petrochemical industry, and the fundamental facts of its underlying geology, the fourth largest city in America essentially has sprawled itself across a dry lake bed, the consequences of which we are finding out now include the discovery that political obstinance, like water, inevitably find its own level. Pierce outlines in this article the vast network of petrochemical industries that cover Houston and the surrounding areas, like ready-to-burst pustules on a sick-body politic. And guess if they're in rich white neighborhoods. And then there's this fact that repeatedly over the past 15 years, the Texas legislature refused to pass any plan to adapt the affected infrastructure as long as that legislation contained any reference to climate change. However, they did manage to pass a law softening the financial penalty companies could face if they are sued for dragging out homeowner damage claims. And lucky for them, that law went into effect a week after Harvey made landfall this past Friday. So in short, the trajectory of a capitalist system built on never-ending growth and extraction, run by corporations and combined with a racist social structure sprinkled with climate change, makes the aftermath of Katrina as inevitable as the ongoing destruction that we are seeing after Harvey. And although we don't have the distance from Harvey that we do from Katrina, chances are that many of the same results will be repeated. As of 2015, only 36.7% of the predominantly black Lower Ninth Ward community had returned home to New Orleans. After the storm, relief efforts were geared almost entirely to the areas of New Orleans that were white and affluent, like the Garden District, the French Quarter. Road Home, a sadly ironic name for the project, was sued in 2008 for simply being flat-out racist. African American homeowners in New Orleans are being unfairly prevented from reclaiming their homes by the discriminatory design and implementation of the Road Home program. African Americans are facing huge gaps between the amount of their Road Home grant awards versus the cost to rebuild their homes when compared to their white counterparts. Meanwhile, insurance companies were handing out checks that wouldn't even have covered a shitty used car. One homeowner recalls that his insurance company sent him and his wife a check for $3,800 for their home that was literally washed away by the storm. Fast forward to today, and people are still not free from the devastation. Devastation that, by design, never sought to help the people, but instead sought to use their suffering as an excuse for a new hospital, or a new park, or a new housing development. Back in 2013, Bloomberg Business reported that a single developer in New Orleans had, since Katrina, developed 18 projects in New Orleans, including condominiums, hotels, and luxury lofts with floor-to-ceiling windows at a former rice processing plant. Up next, a residential complex planned for a weed-choked lot currently home to an abandoned school bus. Bloomberg's bottom line for New Orleans investments showed that commercial real estate deals in New Orleans totaled $424.7 million through May, up from $301.1 million in all of 2012. Meanwhile, a Guardian report from 2015 showed that while the lower Ninth Ward still didn't have a grocery store or pharmacy, a new 5-story condo project had been approved by City Council on the site of a bulldozed school. Meanwhile, Bywater, a community across the water from the lower Ninth Ward, lost 64% of its black population while gaining 22% more white people. I wonder, is this the kind of peaceful ethnic cleansing that Richard Spencer advocates? And yet, I fail to see what's peaceful about letting people literally die of thirst in a sea of polluted water while you try to arrest someone for stealing a fucking sandwich. And oh yes, on that same note, if you've been paying attention to the news, you'll know that fearless ABC journo Tom Lamas in Houston was quick to notice and then report quote-unquote looters to the police after he found them stealing from a supermarket in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. And while Twitter was quick to point out that he is in fact an asshole, and that getting food in the midst of a hurricane is what one might call survival, his reaction is typical and indeed again inevitable. It is the reaction that we saw in Katrina when the only thing that Wolf Blitzer could find to say was, "Oh, so poor, so black." No, really.
You simply get chills every time you see these poor individuals. As Jack Cafferty just pointed out so tragically, so many of these people, almost all of them that we see, are so poor and they are so black.
Thanks, Wolf. That's stellar reporting. And the sad thing is, that is stellar reporting for them. The fact that he even meagerly made the connection that those bearing the brunt of this system's horseshit response to disasters are poor and black is way beyond the usual scope of corporate media reporting. And the fact that Tom was so proud to let the world know that he found some people surviving and then proceeded to call the cops on them is also sadly not surprising. The corporate media is a mirror of the empire that they consistently fail to stand up to. They are on the payroll just as much as the politicians and pundits who sit around those vapid tables and talk about Trump tweets and high heels. For example, after Hurricane Sandy, most media outlets were falling over themselves to congratulate Obama on his glorious and presidential handling of the disaster. Meanwhile, on the ground, the government's improvement from Katrina in 2005 was mostly theoretical and largely unhelpful to many. People without power in the once again poor and predominantly black and brown communities sat abandoned, freezing and starving in their destroyed homes and apartments. Government food drops were scarce and were hardly ever actually delivered to people, instead dropped off at random intersections where people could take whatever they could, leaving disabled and or elderly to fend for themselves in apartments with no electricity, elevators, heat, or food. Indeed, as Chris Hedges outlines in his book, Wages of Rebellion, the state provided little in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane to those affected by the storm. Volunteers hastily collected food in church basements and drove it out to the devastated communities. On large pieces of cardboard hanging from the ceiling were the words, "Occupy Sandy Relief." The basement was filled with stacks of donated supplies, including pet food, diapers, infant formula, canned goods, cereal, and pasta. The church was converted 2 days after the storm into a food bank and distribution center. Hundreds of people were converging daily on the church to work in the relief effort, and volunteers with cars or vans were delivering supplies to parts of New York and in New Jersey. Occupy Sandy saved people. It built bridges across the gaping chasms carved by a system that, again, by design, is not interested in people or planet, but in profit. In the aftermath of Katrina, Governor Blanco wasn't just helping to aid in the shock doctrine robbery of Charity Hospital, but indeed, even before and during the storm, her unsure and painfully slow decision-making cost precious time and therefore lives. "We're going to pray that the impact will soften," she said, as she let the window to safely evacuate the city pass her by. Her aloof assessment of and action regarding the suffering of her constituents smacks unbearably loudly of a woman wholly disconnected from those she has been tasked with governing. But then, of course, there's Mayor Nagin. The Mayor Nagin who steered 1,500 cops, basically the entire remaining force, towards people who were looting, aka surviving, rather than deploy police to rescue those stranded and dying. Turns out that this play was just one in a large playbook of sociopathic moves designed to use suffering as a bargaining chip. Rather atypically, however, in 2014, Ray Nagin's luck ran out. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud, bribery, and related charges involving crimes that took place before and after Katrina devastated the city in August 2005. A jury convicted Nagin of accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, money, free vacation trips, and truckloads of free granite for his family business, from businessmen who wanted work from the city or Nagin's support for various hurricane recovery projects. Profit from pain. It's the American way. At least officially, but unofficially? And outside the narrow lens of corporatized media disaster porn, there are the Occupy Sandys. There are communities coming together to help each other. As Newsweek pointed out in their reporting from Katrina's aftermath, while government funding came with strings attached, political motivations and top-down approach, thousands of volunteers focused instead on fixing the city one issue at a time, side by side with the resident they had come to help. And again, the same was true with Sandy. And Hedges pinpoints and encompasses these past and future actions with his conclusion in Wages of Rebellion. As we descend into a world where we can depend less and less on those who hold power, movements like Occupy Sandy will become vital. These movements might not be called Occupy, and they might not look like Occupy, but whatever the names and forms of the self-help we create, we will have to find ways to fend for ourselves. And we will fend for ourselves only by building communitarian organizations. Oddly, and quite uncomfortably enough for Hedges and his horrendous disdain for all things Antifa, that self-help has been, is, and will often be called Antifa. Side note here, if you didn't catch his atrocious collection of words creating a false equivalency between Antifa and the fascists that they fight, grab a stress ball and give it a read. You can also find my response on my website, artkillingapathy.com. Now, while Hedges stands on a pedestal of false moral superiority, his crude commentary completely discounts the hard work that Antifa are currently doing in places like Houston, doing exactly what he suggested doing in his damn book. Granted, maybe it's hard to see from all the way up there, but as someone who has been in literal trenches, I kinda expected better. If I had one thing to say to the left, including Father Hedges, it is to stand on the ground. Look at who stands with you, not beneath you. Look at the whole picture, not just the little pieces that you don't like. You have to be able to look at the work that people do as a whole, not focus in, like corporate media, on one day or one tactic that you personally thought was a bad idea. To arrogantly and pretentiously lambaste an entire group of people just because you would have done things differently. As a microcosm example, Chris Hedges. I respect the shit out of his overarching body of work. Sure, he certainly has duds like I don't believe in atheists, and the most recent articles definitely only fit to be used as toilet paper, but still. I recognize his contributions. His analysis of the US empire is predominantly brilliant and important. And right now, on the ground in Texas, the work that Antifa is doing is hugely important. It is once again on the front lines, this time saving lives in the vacuum of social services. Frequent show contributor and gonzo journalist Kit O'Connell wrote a piece last week titled "Mutual Aid is Anti-Fascism." As Kit points out, most of the people I know organizing to fight white supremacy, like myself, spent the weekend organizing Harvey Relief. And Harvey Relief is anti-fascism in the long view. We're helping people, connecting people, and showing them alternatives. When Hedges wrote that those recruited to the fascist ranks are, like all of us, suffering under the same capitalist quagmire, he was not wrong. But while his diatribe does little to dissuade would-be fascists, people like Kit and his comrades are building, focusing on those who feel isolated and desperate, and reaching out. Antifa and radicals like me know that after Harvey we can both save lives and show that mutual aid is stronger than fascism and capitalism. In his piece, Kit also points out that mutual aid is built on a community level, so please don't throw money at big NGOs like the Red Cross. Indeed, during the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, one reporter noted, there was no security, no water, no medical help, aside from a pair of overwhelmed nurses, and no sign of any organized relief at the convention center. Just people crying, help us, to passing cameramen. Where is the Red Cross? Johnson plaintively asked a Newsweek reporter. And while the Red Cross did organize some food drops after Sandy, there didn't seem to be much consideration as to whether or not the food was actually, delivered to people, rather than left once again somewhere at an intersection to hopefully be used by someone or something. Records for their disaster relief efforts are also hugely lacking. And if Haiti is any indication of their modus operandi, you can expect to not expect your money to be used most efficiently in helping those really in need. Furthermore, as outlined in a recent Democracy Now! Special with Jonathan Katz and Scott Crow, Scott, if you'll recall, was with us in episodes 114 and 115, Jonathan outlines the failed history and present of the Red Cross, including a current CEO that was pulled from everyone's favorite charity, AT&T. In short, he says, this is how the Red Cross works. Look, give us money. Trust us. We're not going to tell you what we're doing, and we're not going to give you any way to hold us accountable. Both Jonathan and Scott have seen firsthand the failures of the Red Cross in Haiti and New Orleans, respectively, to help those really in need. And as Scott put it, what we have really seen in modern society is that we need decentralized disaster relief, that smaller groups of people, autonomous communities can actually be first responders and actually build for the longer term without larger governments or things like Red Cross. So, like in Houston just the other day, we saw people of all political persuasions that might not agree, that might be in the streets arguing with each other around a political campaign. They were all doing the same thing. There were hundreds of boats from people from rural communities and fishing communities who were waiting to get in. And you also had anarchists on the ground who were doing distribution of food and water in very limited supplies, while the city was still absolutely flooded. The charity industrial complex will not save us from the worst effects of climate change, or indeed the human disasters designed by capitalism that follow. And for good reason. The charity industry is built into capitalism, a pressure valve to keep this obese machine grinding us through its gears while the media play us a lullaby. Be it Katrina, Sandy, Harvey, or whatever benignly named disasters are to come, put your money and your action towards locals, the people on the ground that know what they need because they're living it. A good place to start for the Harvey disaster is noredcross.org, which gives you a list of orgs to support that aren't the Red Cross. Kit and Scott also recommend following the Austin Common Ground Relief. Born from the Common Ground Relief, community aid collective founded by anarchists such as Scott after Katrina hit. You can follow them on Twitter for updates and links to local organizations that need your help. More links as suggested by Kit will be included in the show description on YouTube, as well as the last slide of the show. Now, before we wrap up this week, two quick things on the front lines that need a mention. First up, for those of you who missed last week's episode on the Loa La Vie camp in Louisiana, please do give it a watch. Cherie Foytlin outlines the powerful resistance to big oil happening in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, and that story will give you some necessary context for upcoming events. Such as this weekend on September 9th, there will be a national day of action to stop ETP, Energy Transfer Partners. Connecting communities across the nation, this coalition is focusing not only on the company as a whole, but on current projects such as the Mariner, Bayou Bridge, and Rover pipelines. To learn more and to attend or indeed organize an action in your area, visit stopetp.org. Also requiring a quick frontline mention is the still ongoing battle for the net. Late last week, the FCC officially closed the comment period for their plans to dismantle net neutrality and make the internet a series of ludicrous toll roads and barriers for the flow of information, ideas, and free speech. Interestingly enough, the powers that be are trying to block the wrong floods. Oh, capitalism. Anyway, while some might think that their work here is now done, the real work is in fact just beginning. Throughout August, town halls and congressional meetings were held in home districts to pressure members of Congress to support net neutrality, to make it politically toxic to dismantle our access to the internet. The battle now continues. We saw what a cohesive effort could do 2 years ago when we won the first net neutrality battle. And before that, when we beat back SOPA and PIPA. Now, once again, we have to ramp up and mobilize to defend our digital rights, indeed, our human rights in the digital age. For more information on how to stay up to date on the fight for the net, visit fightforthefuture.org and protectourinternet.org. And that will finally do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Are you as uncomfortable as I am? Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide and the description to see the sites mentioned in this week's show, including how you can help Harvey victims. For continuous updates throughout the week, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Also, for all of you podcast listeners out there, the Act Out podcast comes out every Friday, available on iTunes and Libsyn at actout.libsyn.com. From the literal Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and shoved my shove. I'm not